So now we're going to go ahead and introduce the next panel. The moderator is Brooks Hilliard. He is an experienced panel moderator, having moderated numerous panel discussions for the Phoenix Rotary 100, as well as extensive work with Braver Angels, the country's largest organization focused on reducing political and cultural polarization in the United States. So we'll go ahead and welcome them out.
Thank you, Annie. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for that introduction. I would like to start by introducing, our topic in this hour is election process, open primaries, runoffs, top four, what are the options? And I want to start by introducing our four panelists, and then we'll give each of them a chance to tell us a little bit about themselves and what they're focused on. First, we have Chad Pierce. He's an attorney, a legal strategist for the Independent Voter Project, and the founding board member for the National Association for Nonpartisan Reformers. John Opdycke is the founder and president of Open Primaries. He's been working in the area of independent, alternative, and reform politics for the past 30 years. Dan Meek co-founded the Independent Party of Oregon, and he's been a 20-year leader in the areas of campaign finance reform, transparency, and consumer protection, among others. And then Sass is the former deputy director of the Equal Vote Coalition, which is the organizer and sponsor of this symposium, and he's now working with for the Respect Voters Coalition. He's also a board member for Democracy Without Elections and the Equal Vote Coalition. With that introduction, Chad, would you, John, I see you're up. Would you like to start telling us a little bit about yourself? You have 3 minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Brooks. It's great to be here. My name is John Opdycke. I am the president of Open Primaries. We're a national advocacy and education organization working to enact and protect open and nonpartisan primaries all across the country. This is a big year for primary reform. There's referendum on the ballot in 7 states, 6 states plus Washington, D.C. We're also playing defense in Alaska and, incubating campaigns in a half dozen other states, as well as legislative efforts in states like Pennsylvania and Kentucky and Tennessee and Rhode Island. There's just I've said this a number of times on the media. When I founded Open Primaries back in 2009, and it was the experience was kind of like founding a UFO research organization. People looked at me like I was a little off kilter. Open primaries, primary reform was not really considered a legitimate political reform. It was seen as esoteric and somewhat irrelevant. The real reforms were campaign finance reform and redistricting reform. And I think the thing I'm most proud of is having played a modest but important role in getting this issue into the mainstream. The fact that there are so many independent voters that are locked out of voting is a real problem that we have to deal with as a country. And we're making progress on that. So that's who I am, and glad to be here.
Thank you, John. Chad, you want to go next? You're muted, and you have 3 minutes.
All right, I'm Chad Pierce. I'm still learning how to unmute myself on Zoom after several years of Zoom meetings. I've been the legal strategist for Independent Voter Project since about 2006. I think, like John, our work in the space, open nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting has started off in an esoteric space, but now I'm happy that it's being discussed within the context of other reforms like ranked choice voting and star voting and a lot of other things, because they relate to each other. They're not combative. One thing I emphasize, I've been attacked as an undercover Democrat. I've been attacked as a undercover Republican. I just emphasize I represent the Independent Voter Project, right? The voter is a different party. I mean, when you look at the legal aspects of election law throughout history, there's generally two parties, not political parties, but parties in the courtroom. It's generally the political party or a political party and the state. Our lawsuits have all been focused on, like, let's take off that perspective. Let's look at this from an individual voter's perspective. The voter versus the state. The state sets up primary election process. They set up primaries. They set up the whole election process, whether it's the state or it's the federal or it's a municipality. And so we look at it through that lens. And so we've been supportive of open primaries, nonpartisan primaries, those kinds of things, because we believe that primarily you have to start off with a process that treats every voter the same, regardless of party. And from there, we should discuss several different processes of how we can best give those voters even more meaningful votes.
Thank you, Chad. Dan, why don't you go next? 3 minutes.
Yeah, Dan Meek here. Because Oregon made it much harder to qualify a non-affiliated candidate for the ballot back in the early 2000s, I founded the Independent Party of Oregon in 2007. We now have about 5% of all registered voters in the state, about 145,000 members. My primary interest, though, has actually been in campaign finance reform in Oregon, which is often ranked near the bottom of campaign finance regulation. In 2008 and 2014, I led the opposition to the top two primary ballot measures in Oregon, both of which were defeated by 67% no votes. But I do recognize that closed party primaries end up restricting voter choices in the general election to candidates who are each supported by a very narrow slice of the voters. And now in Oregon, about 43% of all Oregon registered voters are not members of major parties. That increase is largely due to the automatic voter registration system that Oregon set up about 10 years ago, 8 years ago maybe, at the Department of Motor Vehicles, that does not allow a new registered voter to choose a party. So they're all just lumped into the non-affiliated category. But I have been, converted to the belief that that limiting primaries to partisan primaries is not a good idea. So I'm an organizer for a Final Five ballot measure for the 2026 ballot in Oregon. The group is called the Oregon Election Reform Coalition. But what we're proposing is actually quite different from the typical top two or even the top 4 or 5 measures. The major difference is that our measure would not allow what I call hijacking of party labels. In California, Washington, and Alaska, anyone can, run in the primary election, or if they qualify in the general election, and print next to their names the names of any political party they want, even if they have nothing to do with that party.
Dan, can you wrap this up, and can we get into this in the discussion?
Oh, I thought there was 3 minutes. In any event, our measure doesn't allow party label hijacking. We also change the date of the primary to a much later date than is currently in Oregon for another good reason. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And Sass, I apologize for using the wrong pronouns for you earlier. Please accept my apology.
All right, sounds good. Hey everyone. I'm Sass. I do a lot in the voting method reform space. I also now realizing I'm actually the only panelist who hasn't founded an organization. I've been trying to participate in all the ones that already exist. I've done work with the Equal Vote Coalition, with the Respect Voters Coalition, volunteered with Center for Election Science, and I'm on the board of Democracy Without Elections and Equal Vote. And for me, really, it's there are a lot of great systems. There are a handful of really bad ones. And there's no single one that works best. There's multiple different versions of primaries that I think have their place. And there's also ways to do things well without any kind of primary process at all. And it's all about finding the right fit for that community. And the most important thing is we need to engage the electorate, and we need to talk to voters about what they want. We need to bring information and resources, allow them to participate, ask questions so they can make informed decisions. And once we've solidified, this is okay. Now we know the outcomes that they're looking for. Now we can construct a system that achieves that, and then we go do it. And that's what the previous panel was about. And leveraging the science that we have for winning campaigns or winning over voters or marketing or whatever to make it happen. So I'm super excited today to be on this panel and to have this discussion, and to just help bring this, get this discussion to be really grounded, because I think it's really important to be able to understand all the pros and cons of each of the different proposals.
Thank you, Sass. Now I'm going to ask each of the panelists, or maybe each of the panelists, a question or two, but we're really going to focus on the panelists talking among themselves rather than, because you're here to hear them, not me. But Sass, perhaps you could start out. We've talked a little bit about different kinds of primaries, and I think it might be worthwhile for you to start out and talking about what the different kinds of primaries are.
Yeah, so we ahead of time, sharing my screen now, picked out a handful of terms that we're gonna use for this panel. There's a lot of different terminology out there that's used, and it can get a little confusing. So these are the 4 terms we're going to use today when we're going to talk about potentially talk about 4 different kinds of primaries. Importantly, primaries are elections that come before the general election, and somehow, some way, there are multiple winners of that primary or primaries that then go on to the general election ballot. May or may not be restricted to that. But so we're going to use the term people's primary to refer to a public election that is open to all active registered voters, regardless of party affiliation. All candidates run on the same ballot. Party affiliation is listed alongside the candidates. Multiple candidates from the same party can run. And then the multiple winners of this election, typically 2 or 4 or 5, will be the only candidates on the ballot in the following general election. Non-partisan primary is another term we'll use. This is similar to a people's primary, but the only difference is that candidates do not have party affiliation, or at least not that shows up, not in an official capacity that shows up on the ballot. There's also partisan primaries, and there are 2 versions of that. There's closed partisan primaries and open partisan primaries. So in closed partisan primaries, each party holds its own election to determine the one single candidate from its party who will go on to the following general election. Voters are required to be registered with a party to vote in its primary. And in systems that have partisan primaries, you don't have to win a partisan primary to get onto the general election ballot. You can just run as an unaffiliated candidate or sometimes an independent candidate, depending on your state's terminology, and you can just run only in the general election. So closed partisan primaries it's a mechanism for the parties to only send one candidate to the general election. And then open partisan primaries is similar, but each voter can decide when they go to vote, they can decide which party's primary they want to vote in, and voters do not need to be affiliated with a party in order to vote in its primary. So most states have partisan primaries for their state and federal elections. Some of them have closed partisan primaries, some of them have open partisan primaries. So these are the 4 types of primaries that we'll be talking about today. And then, of course, there's a 5th option, which is you just don't have any primaries of any kind. So just wanted to lay that out so that way we can be consistent. So even though the panel is called open primaries sometimes gets confused between a people's primary and open partisan primary. So we're gonna use these 4 terms today for clarity's sake.
Sass, I live in Arizona, and we have some elections that use each one of those. So and as a registered independent, I've participated in all of those except the closed partisan primary. Because I'm not a member of any party. John, I think you were mentioning that you've been involved in getting a open primaries in California. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was the first campaign that open primaries worked on. As Chad mentioned, Chad and his team were instrumental in developing the policy for top 2. Governor Schwarzenegger, who had tried to do it back in 2004 but lost and Lieutenant Governor Abel Maldonado were instrumental in kind of pushing it in the legislature. And then a coalition came together, including the AARP, Independent Voter Project. What was it? Common Cause? Who was the other big player there, Chad? It was Common Cause, right?
Opposed it, actually. There was AARP was a big one.
Right.
That was really primarily that. Abel Maldonado came in and
Yeah.
and that helped have the legislature put it on the ballot. But the political class all thought it was dead because both political parties didn't support it. They put it
Every
on
political party, not just the Democrats and Republicans.
Correct.
The
Right.
Greens, the Peace and Freedom, Libertarian, American Independent, they all opposed it. Ralph Nader came out and opposed it. And it was a real kind of people versus the parties campaign. And we crushed it. And I think the voters of California were really sick and tired of a level of institutionalized partisanship that had paralyzed the state, that had led to decades or multiple years of late budgets, electricity brownouts. Democrats and Republicans in the legislature couldn't even have breakfast together. They were literally couldn't be seen in public. It was so partisan. And the campaign in 2010 was the voters saying, enough already, let's break this down. And it's had a big, very positive impact in California.
So before we get our heads chopped off too, because we know there's a lot of folks probably invested in election reform, and folks that we founded our national, John was one of the founding members of the National Reformers, and we are not adversarial to more choices and ranked choice voting. In fact, the primary, our primary focus right now in Independent Voter Project is now moving from a top 2 to a top 5. But from the lens, I think that John and myself are working from, the first most difficult step was to break that institutional barrier and basically say, no, primary elections don't belong to the political parties. They belong to the people of California. And so what we could do was get a top 2, right? We had discussions amongst ourselves. Should we allow write-in candidates, right? And there was the argument amongst ourselves is, because that gives voters more choice. And then there was the counter argument of saying, well, but the reality is the political consultants from the political parties will manipulate that process, and they'll use that to actually minimize the voice of voters. And so within that context, like what we ended up with was top 2. There is no doubt there are unintended consequences. But I think if you start from where we were, closed partisan primaries were eons forward, and that now we've laid the foundation to say, okay, how do we improve it further from here? And where we've come from, not because it was our idea, but it was talking in groups like this with John and other folks from ranked choice voting world, to say, look, we can all agree that a top 5 model is even better than the top 2. So we think that that's a practical next step, and that's why we've joined the coalition to try to make that happen.
Dan, you're involved in trying to get a top 5 initiative in Oregon. Maybe you could talk about the differences between a top 2 and we haven't really defined ranked choice voting, and I would presume that once you get into a top 5, and correct me if I'm wrong, that ranked choice is part of that. But maybe if you could explain the difference between top 2 and top 5, and if ranked choice is relevant to that, could you address that also?
Sure. Our current proposal is for top 5, but it's to use also some form of instant runoff voting in the general election, not necessarily ranked choice voting. Star voting could also be used in the general election under our measure. The main difference between what's been proposed in Oregon before and our current proposal is not really the difference between top 2 and top 5. Top 5, of course, would produce fewer irrational results due to, vote splitting, and if, for example, if there are lots of candidates in the primary identifying with a single political party, that reduces the chance for any of them to advance to the general election under top 2. So under top 5, there would be less of that problem. And under our proposal at this point, we don't use ranked choice, any form of instant runoff voting in the primary election. It would still be just, everybody gets one vote and the top 5 advance to the general election. But for our measure, the big difference is party labels. I think that party labels are very important. Various surveys show that it is the single most important piece of information to a large portion of voters, including me. So having a ballot that is a primary ballot that is full of folks who take party label names next to their, party labels next to their names, who may have nothing to do with the party. For example, a white supremacist could come along and put Progressive Party next to their, or Green Party next to their names on the ballot. And under top 2 systems in the states that I've mentioned, the Green Party can't do anything about it. So I don't want to have the
Has that actually happened?
Pardon me?
Has that actually happened, the hijacking of party labels?
Sure. People in Washington and California can put down anything they want. In fact, in Washington, they can even put down the names of fanciful parties that don't even exist. So in order to prevent that,
that's occurred.
Yeah.
Okay.
And our measure doesn't allow anyone to put on either the primary or general election ballot the name of the political party next to the candidate's name, unless the political party has actually endorsed the candidate. And our measure allows any political party to endorse any number of candidates for an office in the primary or general election. The candidate gets to print up to 3 party names next to the candidate's name on the ballot, as long as they've all nominated that candidate. And that's really the main difference.
Sass, the title of this panel is Primaries, Runoffs, and Top 4. I think top 2 is been what has most often been enacted in states that have reformed their primaries. The talk here is top 5, and Dan mentioned star voting. Can you explain for those of us who are new to this what star voting is and how that differs from ranked choice?
Yeah, so I prepared a slide for this too. And I actually shared the link a little bit earlier in the chat, so people can go check it out on their own. But yeah, there are various different voting methods. And the primary system that we choose and the voting methods that we choose for the elections are independent of each other. They matter, they affect each other, but you can mix and match however you want. So the typical system that we currently use is choose one voting. Each voter can only vote for or support one candidate. Candidate with most votes is elected. 2 other methods that we've talked about so far are ranked choice voting and star voting. So in ranked choice voting, each voter ranks candidates in order of preference. Votes are tallied in rounds. Your vote goes to the highest ranked remaining candidate on your ballot, if any. Otherwise, your vote is discarded. If a candidate has a majority of remaining votes in a round, they are elected. Otherwise, the remaining candidate with the fewest remaining votes is eliminated. So that's ranked choice voting. In star voting, voters score candidates from 0 up to 5 stars. The 2 candidates with the most stars overall are finalists. Your 1 full vote automatically goes to whichever finalist you gave more stars to, and then the finalist with the most votes wins. And so if you only have 2 candidates in an election, there's no need to use any of these alternatives. You just pick the one you prefer, and that's it. You would just use choose one voting for that. It's once you have more than 2 candidates is when you can run into problems with vote splitting and all these new issues manifest, and you want to start considering alternative methods. So if we're talking about a top 4 or top 5, we would do that. So does that feel like it satisfactorily answers your question, or is there another part that I missed?
It does. I have another question, and that is, would any of these methods allow for someone to be elected with a plurality rather than a majority?
All voting methods are plurality methods. So there's no voting method can guarantee a majority winner in a single election with more than 2 candidates. So I'll take that back. If you have a top 2, then yes, you're going to get a majority winner, unless it's an exact tie, which is negligible. But once you have more than 2 candidates, you cannot guarantee a majority winner. For example, you could have 3 polarized factions with 3 candidates. No candidate would have majority support. So what you're trying to do, ideally, is you're trying to build consensus. And so methods like approval voting, ranked robin, star voting, and many others do a really good job at that. Some methods like choose one voting, ranked choice voting don't really achieve that. But in any method, you can have a majority winner. You can have a candidate who has majority support from the electorate. You in methods like approval, ranked robin, star, you can have multiple candidates who have a majority of support. So yeah, But in all methods,
at the end, as you start eliminating the lower scoring candidates, and you get down to 2, at the end, doesn't one of them have a majority of the remaining votes?
Only of the remaining votes, not of the electorate, not of all the voters.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, this is
because
really
some people would not have voted for more than 1 or more than 2, and all of theirs might have been eliminated. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe they're not allowed to. There's about 50 to 60 jurisdictions in the US that are using ranked choice voting right now, and in only one of them are you guaranteed to always be able to rank all of the candidates, and that's Alaska. And that's because they do a final 4, and so that you're able to rank them all. Everywhere else, you could potentially have more candidates than the available number of ranks, and so maybe you do use all of your ranks and you fill out your ballot properly, but all the candidates you rank get eliminated before the final tally, and then your vote isn't counted. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you didn't express yourself. Maybe you maximized your expression on the ballot, but your vote still gets exhausted and kicked out because the system itself doesn't allow for it, and there's logistical problems. It gets complicated. Yeah, so it could be that your vote isn't counted because that you just weren't allowed to rank all the candidates.
Okay. And anybody have any? Now, it seems to me that from what I've heard, the top 2 has been the most widely enacted nationwide, and certainly, I know in Arizona where I live, there's a top 2 measure on the ballot this fall. The promoters of that originally wanted to go to ranked choice and found that was too difficult to explain to the electorate, or they felt it was, and so they backed off the ranked choice option and went to top 2. Can we talk about what has gone right with top 2 voting and what has not gone as well as might have been hoped with top 2 voting? Why don't we just get into a discussion on that, because you all have some knowledge of the different options.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly say, you said widely adopted, meaning that there are 3 states that have a people's primary. 2 of them use a top 2, 1 of them uses the top 4 currently. So California and Washington, as Dan mentioned earlier, have a top 2, and then Alaska has a top 4 where they use ranked choice. There are a handful of states, as Annie was saying earlier today, there are a handful of states considering changing their systems, adopting various alternative primary systems. You don't have to use ranked choice voting with the top 4, top 5. You could use choose one voting. You could use star voting. You could use approval voting. There is St. Louis, Missouri, as Ben was talking about earlier, uses approval voting with plus a top 2 runoff. And that's actually a really important factor. What voting method you use in the people's primary matters a lot. So St. Louis has approval voting, whereas California, Washington, and Alaska all use choose one voting. And that causes problems, particularly in California and Washington, because you only have 2 people going on. And so vote splitting still occurs. It still causes an issue, especially in those 2 states. You just see a lot of 2 Democrats on the same ticket. And that's the only option that voters have in November, which a lot of voters don't.
Can I address that? I think that's something we should discuss in ourselves. If we take off our party hats, right, and say, look, be party agnostic for a second, right? Be voter centric from a voter's perspective. I think that's exact cases that are very, very misunderstood. Take a district in South Los Angeles right now where you have two Democrats running for assembly. In a cold closed primary system, that race was decided in June. Whichever Democrat won their party's nomination in June represented the entire district in November. That district today, there's one candidate that's generally backed by their party and the traditional power interest within the party. And there's one candidate that's incentivized to walk to the Republican and independent brethren's door and say, you know what? I don't agree with my party on this stuff too. Will you vote for me? And it's the first time in history, Republicans, independents, Greens, Libertarians, their votes actually matter in the general election. That very same thing is happening where I live. There's two Republicans running for an assembly seat where for the entire history of California, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens did not matter in the general election. Right now, everybody's looking at them. Why? Because they're going to decide which Republican. Is it going to be the Republican that's in this camp and has all the institutional? Is it going to be the Republican that's more Trumpian? Is it going to be right? So there's lots of factors. And so I'm just saying, I don't disagree with all this stuff. I totally agree. Vote splitting happens. You end up with, situations that may not be the best for the voters in the general, but those races should be looked at a little bit differently. And I'd argue from a voter's perspective, it has empowered voters in those districts like never before.
I totally agree with
you. Say like never before. Are you saying this hasn't happened in any of the places where there are top two? Where there
I was only saying never before as in previous history of California versus today in California.
No, and just to add to what Chad's saying and what Sass is saying, Nebraska has also had a top two system for state legislative races, not for federal races. And it's been in place for 90 years. And I think Nebraska, because it's been in place for so long, offers some really interesting lessons. And I've spent time in the legislature. I did a little documentary film. We interviewed dozens of members. And one of the things that comes across from a top two system is that, and this would also be true of other people's primaries. So I'm not trying to say it's only the top two, but it's been in place there for 90 years. And when you run for the legislature in Nebraska, you could be a conservative Republican, a liberal Democrat, a independent candidate like the US Senate candidate, Dan Osborne. Every single candidate is incentivized both legally and culturally to go out and knock on doors of every voter in their district, not just members of their own party. And that has led election after election. If you're a Democrat in Nebraska, you're used to Republicans and independents knocking on your door, not just Democrats. If you're a Republican, you hear from Democratic candidates all the time. And it's led to a political culture that is far less echo chambery, segregated, siloed. That's one of the biggest cultural impacts of a nonpartisan, a people's primary, is that you change the culture of campaigning and governing in ways that are very significant.
Dan, I think you're a critic, and remember to unmute. You're a critic to some extent of the top two and are much more favorable for the top five, which is the approach that you're trying to put on the ballot in 26. Can you talk about the advantages of the top five over the top two?
Well, just one interesting recent example of top two. Bob Ferguson is the Attorney General of Washington and is currently running for governor. He's a longtime Democrat. Before the primary election, just before the filing deadline in May, a Republican activist recruited two other Bob Fergusons to file as last-minute candidates in the race, both also to be identified on the primary ballot as Democrats, despite their voting history in prior Republican primaries. Now, Washington doesn't register voters by party, so you can't say that anyone is a registered Republican or Democrat. But these folks were clearly not enamored of the Democratic Party, yet they chose Democrat. They chose to put Democrat next to their names on the ballot. And of course, they had names that were identical to the leading Democratic candidate. The ballot order was then determined by the Secretary of State. Ballot order is determined by lottery. The fake Bob Fergusons were listed to be number 2 and number 3 on the ballot for that race. The real Bob Ferguson was to be listed as number 13 among the candidates. So you could imagine that the fake Bob Fergusons would probably absorb a considerable portion of the votes from people who thought that they were voting for the real Bob Ferguson. Fortunately, the real Bob Ferguson was the Attorney General of the state, and he threatened to criminally prosecute the fake Bob Ferguson. So on the last day, the fake Bob Fergusons withdrew their name from the ballot. If he hadn't been the Attorney General, I think those fake Bob Fergusons would have been on the ballot. And this isn't the only time this has happened. In Ro Khanna's first campaign for Congress, there was recruited by some, and his main candidate opponent was a Republican named Vanilla Singh, and somebody recruited a person who apparently had previously worked for Ro Khanna's law firm named Vinesh Singh to run in the primary election in order to split the Sikh vote, I guess, and to confuse people between Vanilla and Vinesh. So this has happened, and the other thing I don't like about top 2 is that it really changes the function of political parties. In other places, the main function of a political party is to help persons running for office and even recruit people to run for office. But in Washington, we are told by political party leaders there that their function has now become discouraging people from running for office, because every person who runs in a top 2 primary with that party's label next to their names increases the probability that none of the people identified with that party will make it to the general election because of vote splitting. So that's really the main problem that I see.
And the top 5 cures that?
Well, top 5 itself tends to cure it because there is a greater chance that any large party will have someone identified with their party, someone legitimately identified with their party make it to the general election. But in the Oregon proposed measure, the main way of dealing with this is to not allow anyone to simply claim to be identified with a party unless the person is actually endorsed by the party.
Sass, you have some thoughts here?
Just a super quick thing I really want to get out before we go into the separate rooms, the breakout rooms, is order of operations matters. And the first thing that needs to happen when we're talking about these different systems is to eliminate vote splitting in the general election. You can do that either by making it a top 2 or by using a better voting method, specifically like approval voting, ranked robin, or star voting. If you eliminate vote splitting in the general election, then all of your other primary options come to light, and those that becomes valid, and you don't have to worry about a lot of these other problems. So like that's the most important first thing that needs to happen, and then everything else opens up. So the reason that we have these close partisan primaries in the first place is to mitigate vote splitting in the general election. But if you just eliminate it altogether, then you've got a lot of great options.
Well, I disagree with that. I mean, if you start with a top 2 system, then I don't think any system in the general election is going to cure that.
So the top 2 is like, that's a way to eliminate vote splitting, because if there are only 2 candidates, there's no vote splitting. So if that's what you're starting with, then if you want to do partisan primaries or people's primary, nonpartisan primary, those are all, or no primary. Well, you can't do no primary, but those all, I guess it would have to be a people's primary. So it would either be a people's primary or, yeah. So people's primary plus top 2 would be it. If you don't do that, if you don't do a top 2, then you need to use a better voting method, and then all your other options are open.
Hi, everybody. I'm here to call the time. But it's been a great conversation today. I really appreciate you guys being here. So we're going to go
pleasure.
to the breakout rooms. And thank you all. It's been a really great panel. I appreciate it. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and set up breakout rooms now, and it'll be just a minute and we'll go there, and then we'll be back here for the next panel in about 20 minutes.